Hello, I'm Jackie Fox, and welcome to Fox Talks. Today's video might be a little bit more somber in some parts because the subject matter we're going to be talking about is transphobia, and I'm going to be teaching you how to debunk some common talking points with logic and data. If you feel like you already know plenty about transphobia and you don't want to go through a whole video of me mansplaining it to you, I get it. Just hit that subscribe button and I'll see you next week. But if you aren't absolutely sure that you understand, and frankly, even I learned some things from reading this, stick around. For anyone who wants to stay, let me explain to you a little bit of why I felt the need to make this video in the first place. See, in my everyday life, I see the same transphobic comments all the time, and I call them out and I engage with them and I try to change people's minds, but it doesn't always work. For me, things came to a point where I really felt like I had to do something bigger. Yesterday, at least the day before this recording, when it hit the news that a woman named Malaysia Booker had been shot in the head and left in the street for dead. But as I'm scrolling, there are some especially disgusting comments. And, I mean, this is kind of something that amounts to a digital funeral. Even though it's just the same shit as usual, it's so much more disgusting in this context. I know that you know the comments I'm talking about. The quote-unquote woman, the asterisk man, that kind of thing. And I don't know what to say to those people because, frankly, they're just pieces of shit. And there really isn't much more to say to them because they're not making an argument. They're just stating to me that they're a piece of shit. But what really pisses me off is the people who like to say, like, when will we start to recognize that this is a mental illness and we should stop coddling people who want to pretend that they're a different sex? People who try to pretend like they're doing the community a favor by being complete assholes because the community has such a high suicide rate. Saying that they're going to save them from suicide or some bullshit excuse like that. And it's reading these comments and things like this as I'm just trying to pay my respects to a person who has died. And more I'm screaming in my head. People are getting upset that the story is even being reported. They say it's not newsworthy. So, I guess the first thing that I'm going to debunk is that this particular story was newsworthy. For one, there were a lot of people that already knew the name Malaysia Booker. BuzzFeed News had written about her this April. The context, though, well, this is something you might want to skip. Just even my description of it might be pretty rough. So, I'm going to put a timestamp right up here, and if you want to go to that timestamp, you'll be able to skip to the end of this whole thing without hearing exactly what happened. But after a minor car accident, a crowd formed around Malaysia Booker. It was a crowd of men yelling slurs, calling her a faggot, telling people to shoot her. A man was offered $200 to beat her, and as he did, other people from the crowd who weren't cheering decided to join in and do things like stomp on her head while she was down. We know all this because there's video of it. And while I considered not putting the video within this one, frankly, just because I didn't want to have to watch it again during editing, I think that it's important to understand the level of hate that we're dealing with here and the level of irrationality that that's bred from. So, if you think that you can handle that, you don't have to do anything. But for everybody else, there's going to be a timestamp right here. And if you go to that timestamp, again, this is your last chance to get out before I show this video. So, do it now. Okay, now that you're gone.
It's cell phone video that's been shared thousands of times online. The victim in blue attacked in broad daylight as onlookers watched. Dallas police say the transgender woman was involved in a minor car crash just before the assault.
Hello everybody, it's Fox from the future. So as I was exporting this video, I was checking the news and there's breaking news out of Dallas. Police have announced that they're investigating whether the killing of Malaysia Booker is related to another fatal shooting and a stabbing in the same area, and both of the other victims were transgendered women. Police say that two of the victims were near the same intersection in East Dallas prior to the crime, and that two of the victims got into a car with someone, and the third allowed someone into their car. So it's possible that we might be able to get clues from the one surviving woman that was attacked, the one that was stabbed, although... So, when I was saying this is newsworthy, it apparently was even more newsworthy than I realized. And when I said this video was going to be somber, it turns out it's a lot more somber than I realized as well. So now that we know why this made the news and the horrible story behind it, let's move on to talking about the most incorrect arguments about trans people. First, is gender dysphoria a mental disorder? No. The answer is no. The APA, the American Psychiatric Association, the makers of the DSM-5 in which this condition is classified, explained this in explicit terms when it stopped using the term gender identity disorder in favor of gender dysphoria. To quote them directly, part of removing stigma is about choosing the right words. Replacing disorder with dysphoria in the diagnostic label is not only more appropriate and consistent with familiar clinical sexology terminology, it also removes the connotation that the patient is disordered. Quoting the UK's National Health Service, gender dysphoria is a recognized medical condition for which treatment is sometimes appropriate. It is not a mental illness. Additionally, being trans isn't the mental condition or a mental disorder itself. Living as trans is in fact the treatment to the medical condition. And not all trans people deal with severe dysphoria. It's barely or not even present for some trans people, while it's medically excruciating for others. These facts show that psychological distress and disability aren't inherent from being trans. So, being trans doesn't meet the definition of a medical disorder, a psychological state that causes significant distress or disability. Put another way, the mismatch between body and internal sense of gender is not a mental illness. Instead, what needs to be addressed are the stress, anxiety, and depression that often go along with it. So as it stands, it's widely accepted as a serious medical condition. And one of the other types of comments I see is people saying that people like this need treatment. The way I understand it, treatment for a person with gender dysphoria typically happens in roughly 3 stages. The first stage is seeking a therapist and actually getting a classification as having gender dysphoria. The second part of the treatment is hormone replacement therapy. This isn't something that anyone just rushes into, as some imagine. It's only done with approval, and after it's been determined that the person in question is sure that this is the course of action that they want to take, and that they will be okay with the long-term side effects. But for those for whom this does not assuage their gender dysphoria, they may move on to a third step, and that is surgery. And this seems to be the conclusion that all of these hateful commenters jump to, that every trans person is a trans person as the result of surgery. And that's not necessarily true. They think of it as just an inhumane process of chopping things off and sewing things on. But that's not always the case. At this point, some people will tell you that it's not a good treatment because people are more likely to be suicidal after transitioning, and that a lot of trans people regret their transition, especially those who were at a point after surgery. And this isn't true either. And I'm going to show you that in the data and with a number of studies. The information is so incredibly available and conclusive that there are far better outcomes for people who go through this treatment process than for people who are forced to just deal with or just accept their gender dysphoria, as many of these people often suggest. God damn it. The first study looked at people with gender dysphoria who were treated with hormone replacement therapy. Quoting their declared results in their entirety, 3 uncontrolled prospective cohort studies enrolling 247 transgender adults, 180 being male to female, 67 being female to male, initiating hormone therapy for the treatment of gender dysphoria were identified. The studies measured exposure to hormone therapy and subsequent changes in mental health, e.g., depression and anxiety, the quality of life outcomes at follow-up. 2 studies showed a significant improvement in psychological functioning at 3 to 6 months and 12 months compared to the baseline after initiating hormone therapy. The third study showed improvement in quality of life outcomes at 12 months after initiating hormone therapy for female to male and male to female participants. However, only male to female participants showed a statistically significant increase in general quality of life after initiating hormone therapy. The second is a meta-analysis done by the National Institute of Health that looked at 38 cross-sectional and longitudinal studies, finding, although the levels of psychopathology and psychiatric disorders in trans people, according to services at time of assessment, are higher than in cis population, they do improve following gender-confirming medical intervention, in many cases reaching normative values. The main axis 1 disorders were found to be depression and anxiety disorder. Other psychiatric disorders, such as schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, were rare and were no more prevalent than in the general population. An even larger meta-analysis of 56 peer-reviewed studies determined that in 93% of the studies, the research indicated high overall well-being and mental health status among participants who transitioned, with only 0.3 to 3.8% of participants experiencing regret. Another thing that particularly bothers me about the common rhetoric is the quote of a statistic about 40% suicide rates among trans people. It's hard to say why people have this misconception, but it sure seems like some sort of a disingenuous shitweasel won't quit spreading this lie.
The idea behind the transgender movement as a civil rights movement is the idea that all of their problems would just go away if I would pretend that they were the sex to which they claim membership. That's nonsense. The transgender suicide rate is 40%. It is 40%. And according to the Anderson School at UCLA, it makes no difference. There's a study that came out last year. It makes no difference, virtually no difference, statistically speaking, as to whether people recognize you as a transgender person or not, which suggests there's a very high comorbidity between transgenderism, whatever that mental state may be, and suicidality. That has nothing to do with how society treats you.
The funny thing is, Ben got destroyed by a trans blogger who pointed out that he couldn't even bother to cite the right school, much less the reason for the study or its results. I guess their facts really didn't care about his feelings. Still, some may say that these suicides are caused by a mental disorder, and that hateful rhetoric plays no part in it. Now, we've already talked about the mental disorder aspect of this. But from a number of studies that I've seen, it actually tends to be proven wrong quite easily. To quote a study from the National Institute of Health, gender-based victimization, discrimination, bullying, violence, being rejected by the family, friends, and community, harassment by intimate partners, family members, police, and the public, discrimination, and ill treatment at healthcare systems are the major risk factors that influence suicidal behavior among transgender people. Go figure. And this goes back to say a lot about why the APA made the switch from gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria. Because they say that the psychological harm that comes from the experience of being a trans person is due to society's reaction to trans people, and not something internal, or not something that it would exist without that. And I think that that absolutely makes sense. Because if we lived in a society that was as accepting, it probably wouldn't seem like an existential crisis to experience gender dysphoria and to consider the possibility of living life as trans. So, the next time someone tells you that clearly they have a mental disorder because 40% of them commit suicide, or some other combination of the bullshit talking points I've taught you here today, you'll know how to counter them. And if you check out the links in the description, you'll also have plenty of links to back your points up. So hopefully you won't just look like a screeching liberal. You'll actually be able to say, the facts really don't care about your feelings. It's also probably a good time for me to point out to my audience that I am personally gender non-conforming, and maybe to talk a little bit about my experience of that. I generally present as male. That's not always the case, but I don't necessarily experience gender dysphoria on the physical level as much as I do on like a social emotional level. I don't really identify as being male. A lot of the things that other men tend to do, a lot of the way that they behave is really I don't know, like it just bothers me. Like just guy stuff a lot of times is just like it's upsetting. It doesn't feel right in such a way that like it just makes me want to shut down and stop participating. And as I was a teenager and becoming a young adult, some of these things started getting termed like toxic masculinity, and suddenly I was like, oh wow, so being male doesn't have to mean all these things. And that made it a little bit easier, but at the same time I still don't feel like male is the best classifier for me. And I have to admit, like when people refer to me as female, typically people that I know online that make assumptions based on my name and using like a fox avatar instead of my face, that feels good. Like the first couple times that it happened, it felt good in a way that like I genuinely didn't understand. I was just like, what is this feeling? Oh my gracious. Oh. But despite all of that, I was still raised to fit within kind of the confines of maleness. I remember when I had really long hair, like waitresses or waiters and stuff would often address me as ma'am. If they kind of walked up from behind me and maybe hadn't looked at my face yet, and like they always got really upset, and I was generally pretty cool with it. Like it kind of made me smile, but like they always felt really upset for me. So it kind of like it kind of ingrained this idea that I don't get to be female. And, you know, I was never really accepted as such, and that kind of makes me feel like I don't really have a gender, you know? Like, I wish I could be one of the girls. I wish I could go out on girls' night stuff, like, but I don't think anyone will ever really accept me that way. Um, and I don't really feel any need to physically transition. So I I think that makes it even harder for people to accept you as female, but like on a social level, I've never really felt like a guy. So there you go. I might cut all of that out, but if I didn't, now you know a little bit more about the fox that brings you the news. So there's that. If you think that what I'm doing here is valuable, if you appreciate that I'm bringing it to you without ads, hit that like button. Subscribe for more stuff. Maybe I can help teach you how to rhetorically combat hate in another video. Maybe we can use facts and statistics to further the conversation in our country about all these important topics. Maybe we can make for a more peaceful world. The why would they? Oh Lord. Quoting their declared results in their entirety, 3 uncontrolled prospective cohort studies enrolling 247 transgender adults, broken down into 180 male to female, 67 female to male, initiating hormone therapy for the treatment of gender identity disorder, which is the... See, I don't even want to say that. Like, I just explained why that term is bullshit, and I don't care that they use it in this fucking quote. I'm not going to say it.